What would you consider to be the quintessential NASCAR race? Well, for starters, you'd have a lot of left-hand turns. I know. They do road courses now. I love them. I want to see more of them. But for the most part, they turn left. Then you'd have a stacked field with, let's just say, 6 future Hall of Famers racing in it, one of which had a bad wreck and had to hitchhike home. And then you would have a moonshiner sue NASCAR over the result of the race, and that judge's ruling would just so happen to go on and set legal precedent for pretty much all of American sports. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're talking about NASCAR's first ever Cup race. In the fall of 1945, the Second World War came to a close, and America, like the rest of the world, was trying to return to some sense of pre-war normalcy. This included stock car racing, so all them good old boys got to their local dirt track and got to answering the question of, well, who was faster? However, at this point in history, stock car racing, well, it was heavily regionalized, so one guy in one part of the country could claim to be the fastest ever, and another guy in another part of the country could do the same, and there would just be an endless debate on who the best stock car driver was. Which brings us to Bill France, and in December of 1947, he got together with a group of guys and they came up with an idea for a nationalized stock car racing organization. And the result? Well, it was the National Association of Stock Car Auto Racing, NASCAR. And they wasted literally no time at all, because in 1948 they had a 52 race season using the modified class of car. The reasoning behind using the modified rule set and not say, well, truly stock cars, well, it was a very good one. All of Detroit's auto manufacturers were still transitioning to making passenger vehicles after spending years making weapons of war. The end result was that new cars were extremely hard to come by, so instead of not having a season, they decided to run under the modified rule set. And after that 52 race season, a champion emerged, and it was none other than Red Byron. Now, we did a complete video on Red Byron's life, and frankly, it is absolutely amazing. The man survived getting blown up serving his country in a forgotten campaign during World War II, and then went on to dominate NASCAR. If you want to check that video, well, I'm going to put it right here for you, or you can click the link in the description below. Now, the modified series was great and all. The cars were fast, they sounded awesome, they were great. However, the biggest problem with them was a lot of times they ran without fenders, in some cases they ran without hoods, and it was really hard to decipher what car was what from the stands. And for 1949, well, good news. The production lines, well, they were back to pumping out cars again, and manufacturers and fans alike, well, they wanted to see the cars that they could go out and buy, the cars they would see on the street every day. They wanted to see those cars on the racetrack. So NASCAR had their new premiere series, and they decided to call it Strictly Stock. This is the beginning of what we know today as the Cup Series. And when NASCAR said Strictly Stock, they absolutely meant it, as we'll get to a little later on in the video. Now, to be legal to race in the new Strictly Stock class, cars had to be produced by an American manufacturer from the years of 1946 to 1949. This had all of your usual American suspects and Jeep of all things. Specifically the Jeepster convertible. However, the normal Jeep, well, that was very much outlawed for reasons, I guess. There was a very small amount of modifications teams could make in the name of, say, safety or just making the cars a little bit more reliable, but it wasn't much. For example, teams were allowed to move the fuel pump to the right side of the car. These cars were going around ovals, they were making a lot of left-hand turns. Centrifugal force was going to push the fuel to the right side of the tank. You could see why that was potentially maybe a good idea. Teams could also use any size wheel or tire they wanted. They could use any type of oil or gasoline they wanted, and they could use any spark plug they wanted. Teams could also modify the impeller on the water pumps and use any size jet in the carburetor they wanted to. As for the engines themselves, you get it by now. They had to remain stock. Seatbelts, however, they absolutely had to be modified. Teams could not mount the seatbelts to the seats themselves. They had to mount the seatbelts directly to the floor. See, even back then, there was some thought about safety. Some. NASCAR's first Cup race would take place on Sunday, June 19th, 1949 at the pretty much brand new Charlotte Speedway. Now this track, well, it was a 3/4 mile dirt track that was absolutely brutal on cars. And when you combine that with the fact that this race was going to be 200 laps long, it was going to be a true test of man and machine. And I know what some of you are thinking, that today 200 laps is pretty commonplace for NASCAR. However, remember, this was in 1949. Not only were cars back then not exactly as reliable as cars today, these were stock showroom cars, lightly modified, not the purpose-built tube frame cars that race in NASCAR today. Oddly enough, there was no entry fee for this race. However, there was a $15 mechanical inspection fee. The purse for the race was going to be $5,000, with $2,000 of that going to the race winner, which in today's money is $26,500. With that kind of money on the line for one race, it attracted the best of the best stock car racers from around the country, who not only had the chance to prove who the best was, but there's a pretty penny going to the winner. 33 total drivers would enter the race, a lot of them either finding cars on their way to the track for the event, and some just showing up hoping someone had a car for them. The field was absolutely stacked. 6 of the 33 drivers would end up in NASCAR's Hall of Fame. Among those future Hall of Famers was a man named Lee Petty. Maybe you heard of him. If you haven't, you've probably heard of his son, Richard, who just so happened to win 7 NASCAR championships. So on Lee's way to Charlotte for the big race, he was one of the guys who found a car on the way to the big NASCAR race. And during the race, well, he sort of crashed it. And when I say crashed, I of course mean he flipped it end over end, completely destroying the car, ripping both doors off. And when it came time to tell the owner what had happened to their car, he just sort of chalked it up to racing, moved on, and hitched a ride home. Even Charlotte Speedway themselves didn't realize just how popular this race and series as a whole was going to be. They only expected about 10,000 fans to show up for the race. In actuality, 22,500 fans showed up. And when the racing itself started, well, 2 things became readily apparent. Number 1, attrition. Well, it was going to be incredibly high. Of the 33 cars that started the race, only 12 finished. And technically speaking, only 1 car completed all 200 laps. Sort of. And the second thing, well, it was North Carolina native Bill Blair and his utter domination of the first 3/4 of the race. Of those initial 150 laps, Blair led 145 of them. Unfortunately for Blair, his Lincoln decided it wanted to overheat and, well, he had to retire from the race. Fortunately, however, for Glenn Dunaway, he was now in the lead. Now, Dunaway was one of the drivers who just showed up at the track without a ride, without a car, and was hoping to get lucky and find his way into the race. As fate would have it, noted moonshiner Hubert Westmoreland had a car but no driver. Dunaway and Westmoreland struck up a deal, and Dunaway, well, he crossed the finish line first. See, there was one little problem. See, in post-race inspection, NASCAR officials, well, they noticed some things on Dunaway and Westmoreland's Ford. Chief among which was, well, bootlegger springs. Remember the strictly stock portion of the rule set? Well, bootlegger springs wasn't a factory option from Ford. In fact, they were literally for bootlegging. These heavy-duty springs were made to help the cars cope with the extra weight of hauling moonshine. You can imagine around the rough Charlotte oval how much of an advantage one would get from having, say, heavy-duty springs in their race car. So once NASCAR found the not at all stock and very illegal springs, they immediately disqualified Dunaway and Westmoreland's car. This handed victory to Bill Blair's teammate and Kansas native Jim Roper. At any rate, it took a brutal race, high attrition, someone getting disqualified, but now we finally have an official winner to NASCAR's first Cup race. But we don't. See, Westmoreland, well, he was pissed and decided that his best course of action was to sue NASCAR and seek $10,000 in damages. Yeah, that 10 grand was not only double the total purse for the entire race, but it was just over $132,000 in today's money. So NASCAR's first Cup Series race was not going to be decided on the rough Charlotte dirt the day of the race, as NASCAR had, hoped for. It was in fact going to be settled in a courtroom. As for the court proceedings themselves, the judge came up with the ruling that NASCAR, as the sanctioning body, has the right to not only make the rules, but enforce them as they see fit. This ruling, it ended up being really important in terms of American racing series, American sports leagues, as it actually set the precedent that these organizations are allowed to not only set the rules, but enforce them, as long as those rules don't do things like actually break laws. So after all of that, we actually come to an official result, and that was NASCAR's first ever Cup Series race was won in a Lincoln driven by Jim Roper. In conclusion, NASCAR's first Cup Series race, well, it didn't really go to the organizers' plan. However, it did, well, it was quintessentially NASCAR. You had speed, you had carnage, you had drama, and you had drama that extended past the checkered flag. Now, if that's not NASCAR, I don't really know what is. Hey, if you made it this far, first off, thank you so much for watching today. And while you're here, maybe consider liking the video, maybe even subscribing, and if you're feeling spicy, go ahead and ring that notification bell.